Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. I don't know if you can feel it, but there's a clear sense of excitement among those of us who've been toiling in the trenches of government overspending. And that's because the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, has been tasked with identifying regulatory and spending reforms to shrink government. Yay! Cato's Nowrasteh and Chris Edwards are my guests today to talk about their new report, identifying trillions in spending cuts and other reforms. So Alex is the Vice President for Economics and Social Policy Studies, and Chris Edwards is the Kiltz Family Chair in Fiscal Studies at the Cato Institute, and he's the editor of the very, very important downsizinggovernment.org. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
So I'm going to start with this question. Who had cutting $2 trillion from the federal budget on their bingo card? Alex, do you want to go?
It's on my bingo card every year, but I didn't think I was going to win this time. It's quite a extraordinary statement by Musk, by Vivek, by others who have proposed the DOGE commission. I obviously want to see it happen. It's a long shot. But when somebody says it, I think I've got to jump up and at least say, me too. I want this as well.
Yeah. And I think the fact that you guys put out this report so fast is a testament of basically work that you guys have done, but also like all of us have actually worked on plans to cut spending, going programs by programs. You, Chris, you've been the editor of Downsizing Government. So a lot of the stuff you've had on your bingo card, but it was kind of not easy to predict that this is where it was going to go, because do you remember during the campaign, we were lamenting that, it was just kind of, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. So you're nicely surprised, or?
Yeah, this is fantastic. There's no doubt when politicians say they want to cut and reform government like we do, then it does generate a lot of reporter interest. Trump, I guess the day before yesterday, confirmed that he's interested in privatizing the U.S. Postal Service. And yesterday I got a couple of phone calls from Bloomberg and another fellow major media news source saying, Chris, you've been working on this postal privatization for many years. What do you think about the Trump proposal? And so it is great that, politicians, if they're talking big, it generates interest among reporters for the type of reforms Cato's interested in. Now, whether Congress actually moves ahead with reforms, we can talk about it, we can get into. I noticed Trump yesterday at his press conference said, yes, he agreed with the $2 trillion cutting goal, but he thinks he can do it without hurting anyone, without anyone directly cutting anyone's benefits. So, I think Trump, he has there's a bit of unreality here about his pronouncements. He likes to talk big. Whether he's going to follow through, that's still undetermined.
So go ahead, Alex.
And I do think that's where somebody, a group like Cato comes in, because like Chris said, there's a lot of unreality out there, a lot of misperceptions about the size of the federal government, its budget, and how much is waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Most of this is not waste, fraud, and abuse. Most of it, we think, is destructive public policy that is very bad and undermines many of the issues that we care about and the size of the economy and everything else. But the notion that you can cut $2 trillion and it's just not going to reduce anybody's benefits is it's just absurd. It's just silly. But that's where we come in, because we have these 23 proposals and these 23 chapters to lay out how to do it, how to get that amount of money out there, out of the federal budget, to deregulate large swaths of the economy. But you really can't do it, of course, without cutting somebody's benefits or somebody's job, or deregulating large, basically putting a lot of federal agencies out of business.
That said, I agree with you. And we're going to get into actually what you guys have proposed. But I have to say, I've always been, one of my talking points has always been, you're not balancing the budget on the back of waste, fraud, and abuse. It's very small. But I went and looked at the GAO report that actually says that every year there's between, let's say, $200 billion and over $500 billion in fraud alone. With $100 billion of that certainly in Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, fraud, that's something you cut. At first I didn't actually quite realize it was so big. I mean, it's a significant amount, and you cut that in theory without cutting anyone's benefit except fraudsters. And while it certainly doesn't balance the budget, and it certainly doesn't put us on a fiscal on a sustainable fiscal path if we don't go after entitlement spending, it actually kind of reduces the burden or the size of the cuts. No, don't you think?
I think that's true, but I think reducing fraud actually it's complex sometimes, and you need bureaucracy to do it. For example, with the food stamp program and the school lunch programs, there's a lot of fraud in those programs, but you do need a lot more bureaucracy and paperwork to eliminate and reduce the fraud. Pentagon procurement is full of fraud and abuse, as we know. Raytheon Corporation was recently fined $900 million by the Pentagon for overcharging. But Pentagon procurement it's complicated to reform. So I want the Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk DOJ committee to look into those sort of big reforms. But you can't do those sort of cuts overnight. The cuts you can do overnight is eliminating low value programs, and I think that's where Congress needs to focus next year. Eliminating low value programs. Even, a lot of programs are harmful, as Alex said, but there's just a lot of low value programs for activities the federal government shouldn't be involved in anymore. Those are the easy things to eliminate, and that's where you can save a lot of money right away.
Yeah, well, I mean, the best way to actually reduce waste, fraud, and abuse is to actually really significantly shrink the size of government, right? So, Alex, tell us about this report. How did it come about, and break it down between the three big sections?
So the major point that we make in the report is just what Chris said, right? And what you just said, which is if you want a leaner, more efficient federal government, it needs to be a lot smaller and do many fewer things to focus on the handful of things we think it should be doing. It came about because I believe it was on November 12th, Trump tweeted out, or Truth Socialed, I'm not sure what the verb is on Truth Social, that he was creating this DOJ commission with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk heading it. And 2 days later, I thought this is an opportunity for Cato to put together a large number of our recommendations and policy research over the decades in one short, concise piece to be able to push for this massive amount of cuts. And I wanted to get it out first, a nice big public report first before anybody else, to show how serious we were about it. So I basically pulled out all the stops and asked scholars like Chris and my other colleagues to work, sometimes over Thanksgiving, sometimes not, to put together short 1 to 2 page recommendations in 23 different chapters about specifically which programs to cut, by how much to cut, and where applicable, write down the monetary savings in there. So we're able to get that out in 29 days, including weekends and over Thanksgiving. It contains Cato research in some cases going back decades. And my estimate, and this is just a back of the envelope estimate by looking at the programs people want to cut and how much they want to cut it by, is it's somewhere between about $1.8 and $2.5 trillion in cuts, depending on how deep you go.
Is it over 10 years?
No, in 1 year.
1 year.
If they do everything that we say to the max that we say it in there, right? So I want to put that in there. So we have recommendations. We have these 3 very large buckets of types of reforms. The first are to bureaucracy in the administrative state. The second are cuts to regulation, reforms to regulation. The third are spending cuts and tax reforms. Mm-hmm. And then we have 23 subchapters throughout all of those that go into detail on programs such as financial sector deregulation, healthcare, childcare, Jones Act and maritime laws, as well as numerous different areas of, getting rid of federal DEI and affirmative action, programs that the government can get rid of through executive actions, executive orders issued or revoked by the president, as well as through many, many changes that would have to be done through Congress or other more intensive reforms through the regulatory agencies.
So, Chris, I want to go to you because I used to be my boss at Cato. And I remember at the time, each time there was a State of the Union address, or if there was a budget of the president, all of us would be looking through these documents or the speech, and we would go and say, this is things the government shouldn't do. This is things the state should do. This is thing that, this is subsidizing the private sector. And it kind of feels like in the last 15 years or so, you've kept doing this, but it became less of a thing. Right? They used to be that the free market movement was really kind of into thinking this way, thinking about how do we go about deciding what we should spend on and what we shouldn't. And you obviously have continued, but so can you kind of when you look at let's say a budget document, or you listen to a State of the Union, how do you go about thinking? How do you think about why, what shouldn't be in there? What are your categories of things that we just, that shouldn't be done?
Well, let me go back to what you said first about, a lot of these reforms and cuts Cato has been proposing have been on the agenda for decades, and they haven't yet been done. So if pessimistically, you could say, well, Congress is never going to do these cuts. But on the other hand, there's a reason why we always come back to things like privatizing the Postal Service, cutting farm subsidies, block granting Medicaid, because these reforms make sense to small government reformers, and they have for decades. And because these programs like farm subsidies will never make sense, they will always be on the chopping block. And eventually we will get them. Eventually we will reform these programs. I mean, they're not going away. The farm subsidy program, for example, continues to pump out over $30 billion a year to wealthy farmers. It does not make sense. It has never made sense. And eventually we'll cut it. So, our challenge, Cato's challenge for Congress is, 2025 is the year to cut spending. And it is the year to do something about this giant debt, which is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and will eventually create a financial crisis. So you ask, so what are the types of cuts we think about? I mean, the first thing we should all think about is fundamental to the structure of the U.S. Constitution is that federal spending powers are supposed to be few and defined. The federal government was only supposed to be responsible for spending on certain narrow particular areas. Most government activities were supposed to be left to the state and local governments. So this is federalism. United States is supposed to be, per the Constitution, a decentralized federation. Since the 60s, Lyndon Johnson, the federal government has amassed all this centralized spending power for no reason. All the centralization has not worked. So the first principle is to think about what activities can the federal government no longer afford and are properly the responsibility of state and local government. And, there are a mass of such opportunities to decentralize, K-12 education and housing policy and highways and urban transit spending. These activities can and should be handled by the state governments. The federal government does not need to be involved, and the federal government can no longer afford this spending. So it's time to start getting the federal government out of these properly state and local areas.
So I'm glad you started with this, because people who listen to this podcast, I hope will remember the Doge episode I did with Tom Church and Danny Hales at Hoover. And at the end, we were joking about kind of our dream plan and what we would do. And so I guess we said we would put Elon Musk in front of Tom and Danny to talk about entitlement spending. But I said, I want them to have a 3-hour sit down with Chris Edwards to talk about what to devolve to the states and how to really kind of make a difference. So I'm glad you started with this. And I'm saying this because kind of my first place to start, even though I totally agree with you, and that's where so much of the money is to go after. I mean, I'm for like getting rid of all subsidies to the private sector, all of it, like just kind of, and I'm just so kind of annoyed about the way government subsidies to the private sector is both corrupting the political process, but also kind of the perception that people have of the market, that this is always my number one place to start. Can you give us an idea of how much money we're spending on programs that should actually be handled by the state?
So there's two giant buckets here, Vero. There's, federal subsidies to state and local governments, 1.1 trillion a year. As a separate bucket that you just touched on is federal subsidies to the private sector, which is corporate welfare or industrial policy or business subsidies, whatever you want to call it. I have a new Cato report coming out in January, February that tallies all up those federal subsidies to businesses. That's about 180 billion a year. So they're both misguided, both those big buckets of spending, and we need to reduce both. So so it's about 1.1 trillion subsidies to the states and about 180 billion a year subsidies to private businesses. The federal government can't afford any of that spending anymore, and we need to phase it out.
If you had to pick one on the biggest one or one or two on the stuff to the grant aids to the states, what would it be? Where's the money and where's the thing that politically maybe with this administration is the easiest to go after, even though I recognize that nothing is easy?
Well, the lowest hanging fruit, the ripest thing to cut, in my view, is K-12 education subsidies. The federal government spends about $30 billion a year on K-12 education subsidies to the states. This makes no sense at all. And I think the Republican Party has really changed its position on this. 20 years ago, we had President George W. Bush, who teamed with Ted Kennedy to pass the big No Child Left Behind program that subsidized state governments and manipulated and tried to micromanage education. That was a complete failure, and a lot of that has been repealed and reversed. In the last few years, really over the last decade, we've seen that the vanguard, the leading edge pro-market idea in K-12 schools is state-directed school choice. Over a dozen states now have passed universal school choice programs using state money. And that's where we want to go with school choice reforms. We don't need the federal government involved in K-12. Test scores continue to fall despite all these billions of dollars from Washington pouring onto the states. The problem with all the money coming from Washington is it includes top-down regulations and controls that raise costs and reduce flexibility for state and local governments. A lot of the 16 million state and local workers in the United States spend their time filling out federal forms and federal reports. It's a total waste of money. So I think K-12 is where the Republicans need to start cutting next year if they want to start reducing these subsidies to the states.
I thought you may say also Medicaid, because there's a ton of money, federal money pouring into the states for Medicaid, right?
The single biggest state federal subsidy for state governments is Medicaid, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. The problem with that program, it grows in an uncontrolled manner. For a long time, all the way back to the Reagan administration, Republicans have proposed turning it into a block grant and freezing the amount of money that goes to the states. So each of the states would get a fixed amount of money from Medicaid from the federal government. But in return, the federal government would lift regulations from the states and allow states to flexibly cut their Medicaid program and reform and innovate. So that's something that Republicans have proposed a long time, and they should pursue also.
How big of a saving are we talking about?
Well, you could save by block granting Medicaid and freezing the amount of spending. You could save $300 billion a year by the end of 10 years. The savings would build over time. That would be a major reform to the federal government.
Alex, the first part is cuts to the administrative state. Do you want to give us an overview or some of the things that you think are the most important thing that people may not know? Or
so the ones that are near and dear to my heart is that affirmative action in the federal government and federal contracting is created by executive action and executive order. Two of them created by one by Lyndon Johnson, one by Richard Nixon, that has remained on the books since then. And I think this is really a pernicious influence on American life. I think it is ultimately, a lot of these rules are the origins of a lot of these like really annoying DEI programs that everybody has to deal with. And so I think if you remove the public subsidy for affirmative action, which affects contractors as well. And just about every major firm in the United States is a contractor. So they have to engage in these practices. And they engage in them when dealing with the federal government, but that bureaucracy and structure is in their firms and in their HR departments when they engage in their normal market activities.
Can you give us some example about how that works?
So federal hiring and in federal contracting, they give certain weight to people of, protected classes and marginalized groups over others. There are more rules in terms of letting people, it sort of spawns rules about restrictions on letting people go or firing them and separations. It just clogs up an entire bureaucracy where they focus more on characteristics that don't matter for doing the job, like what people look like or their backgrounds, instead of what really matters, which is their productivity, how devoted they are to the cause. So it's a real annoying thing in my mind. So I think getting rid of, and it creates a lot of inefficiencies. So I think getting rid of that would be a good place to start.
I'm surprised. I'm surprised. This is an executive order that hasn't been overturned by.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of kind of like
stroke of a pen. Stroke of a pen. There'll be some regulatory changes that need to happen as a result of that will take some time to go fully into effect. But yeah, everybody's surprised when you say that. In fact, on most state levels, when the state governments have affirmative action, in most cases, it's also through gubernatorial executive actions. So for instance, the great conservative former governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, got rid of the state's affirmative action by just stroke of a pen, repealing older executive orders that have been in place by that. And so, Jeb Bush, who was famously criticized by other Republicans for being this squish in the 2015 campaign, probably did more than any Republican governor up to that point or politician to undermine affirmative action in the United States. So that's a real lesson, I think, for how to get around this.
And I wonder whether they'd be more willing to do it now because of the Supreme Court ruling.
I think they will, and I think they will because there's just more salience on this issue, with the rise of these annoying, woke stuff over the last several years. I think there's just like more of a willingness on Republicans to say no, right? Like if Governor DeSantis is willing to like take over public universities and fire people and restructure them to try to be anti-woke, I have no doubt that the incoming Republican administration would be willing to revoke a handful of executive orders on the books right now.
Yeah. And so what else? So these are the most important, do you think?
Not necessarily the most important, just the most annoying in my mind on there. So Chris actually did some work about reforming the federal workforce in there. He says there's about, in his section, there are about 2.3 million executive branch civilian employees, estimated compensation of about $403 billion in 2025. Of those, 800,000 or so in the Pentagon. And then the U.S. Postal Service employs an additional 550,000 workers. These civilian workers make on average about $157,000 in wages and benefits, as Chris writes in there, in 2023, much higher than the average U.S. private sector worker. So I think we can cut, or as Chris recommends, we can cut some of that pay for them and reduce the size of the workforce. So just doing that alone can save tens of billions, $40 billion cut for instance, by just reducing the size of the compensation by 10%.
And Doge, I mean, that's one of their priority, right? Is to go and to reduce the workforce. But Chris, let me ask you this. Like, for instance, like air traffic control, right? It's one that it's been privatized around the world. You wrote about privatization around the world in your work at Cato. Air traffic control is one of those, and I think Canada did it in the 90s. Is that what they did? Did it in the 90s. Like that's kind of a place where the option is not to go and cut 25% or 75%. I can't remember what they said of the workforce. What you need to do is you need to eliminate, right? You need to kind of get rid of the whole. You need to privatize. So what else? What are the other categories that you guys have in that report, and then you've worked on where, like, the way to go about this is not to just cut, let's say, 75% of the workforce, but to just privatize?
So a couple of things to go back to one point that Alex mentioned that I think it's just fascinating to think about is the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, has, aside from all the uniformed service members, the Pentagon employs 800,000 civilian non-uniformed workers. 800,000. It's the size of a pretty big city just in that one department. It's absolutely extraordinary.
What do they do? What do they do?
Procurement and logistics, all kinds of stuff, and just pure bureaucracy. There have been numerous articles over the years that I've happened to notice from ex-DoD employees that have argued that there's excessive layering in the Pentagon. It used to be that the layer between a young service member and a four-star general was sort of only, a few layers. But now there's just like dozens of layers of middle management. So the Pentagon has become extremely top heavy. And what this does is it slows communication and decision making. I mean, we frankly see now with this New Jersey drone situation, this complete incompetence on the part of the Pentagon to get any kind of clear message to the American people about what is going on with these UFOs or drones. And I think that's partly because the bureaucracy has become so big, they can't really get their message together. We see this 2 decades ago. We saw a really dramatic example of this when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. The Bush administration was so uncoordinated. We had the Bush administration just created this massive new Department of Homeland Security with multiple layers, jam-packed full of political appointees who frankly didn't know what they were doing. It was a complete mess. So I think bigger is worse government. Leaner, smaller government, I think we get much better and faster decision-making for the American people. So the bureaucracy is way too big. One way we can shrink it that both Musk and Ramaswamy have talked about is firing more federal workers. And I've long highlighted the fact that the federal government hardly ever fires poor performers or workers who subject to participated in misconduct. The federal firing rate is only 1/6 as high as the firing rate in the U.S. private sector. Generally, poorly performing federal workers are dealt with like hot potatoes in the bureaucracy. No one wants them in their group, and they're and managers try to throw them around and impose them on other groups and sections in their agencies. So we need to increase the federal firing rate. Is
there a rule that actually prevents them?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of rules. There's both civil service protections and there's union rules for federal union workers that create layers of protection and appeals and legal defenses for workers to prevent their retiring. And so most federal managers don't even bother. They know it's so difficult to remove a federal worker. It's going to impose a lot of time and bureaucracy costs on them. They don't even bother. So going all the way back to the Bush administration, his first budget director Mitch Daniels, tried to increase the firing rate. He was unsuccessful. Trump, in his first term, tried to increase the firing, and he was mainly unsuccessful. But they're gonna drive at it again, and hopefully this time they will be successful. the problem with all these poorly performing federal workers is they reduce morale across federal agencies. I mean, a lot of federal workers, of course, want to do the right thing and want to perform public service for the benefit of the American people, but they've got all these bad performers around them that reduces morale in these agencies. So I think that's really should be a high priority, is to increase the ability of federal managers to fire poorly performing workers.
And then what would you, what are the places, we've talked about USPS, but what are the other places where instead of actually cutting the workers, we should just privatize, period? What is your list?
Right. So there's a lot of federal agencies that actually partake in business activities that could be moved to the private sector. Veronique, you mentioned air traffic control. Our air traffic control system is run as a bureaucracy in the Federal Aviation Administration. This is ridiculous. If you think about air traffic control, this is a high-tech business. We're trying to run a high-tech business within a bureaucracy. This makes no sense in the 21st century. And the American bureaucratic air traffic control system is falling behind more advanced private systems like they have in Canada and Britain. America, of course, was a great innovator in aviation a century ago, but now we're falling behind because the government has taken it over and is trying to control and micromanage it. So we need to free air traffic control by moving it off in the form of a nonprofit corporation, which is the reform that the Canadians have done. Britain also privatized its air traffic control system a couple decades ago. The Postal Service employs 550,000 people, a massive bureaucracy. Letter mail volume has plunged more than in half over the last 2 decades. The system is in crisis. President Trump, to his credit, in his first term, proposed privatizing the Postal Service. The sticking point really is Republicans in Congress. But, as the postal situation keeps getting worse and worse, the system is losing more money. Having a government-run postal system makes no sense. We need to move those 500,000 workers off to the private sector. Germany, Britain, and other countries have privatized their postal systems. There's no reason why we should have postal socialism in this country when Europe has gone to free market postal systems. So, and this is something I've learned over the years. If you look at, there's a lot that American policymakers can learn from other countries, Canada, Europe, Australia. They've done a lot of reforms in these high-income democracies that we can and should adopt here. There's real-world experience now, on privatized passenger rail systems and postal systems and air traffic control systems that we need to adopt here in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, Alex, what do you think is realistic? Because one of the things, I will say this, frankly, I've become more bullish about Doge as kind of, I feel the excitement mounting and because I also see kind of these guys have the biggest microphone ever, and they can actually put this issue, on the table in a way that we've tried and never managed to. But we also have to recognize that there's a certain vibe in this administration. So what do you think is the most likely proposals in your report that could be adopted by this administration?
So I think the obvious civil service reforms are the ones that end a lot of the DEI and affirmative action programs that can mostly be done administratively and through executive orders and revoking older executive orders. I think that's a no-brainer. That's going to happen. I think reversing a large number of environmental overregulations is also a no-brainer. Getting rid of the clean power, making sure the clean power plant rule is dead forever is totally something that the administration can do. They can also put the brakes on many other types of rules that are coming down, rules about tailpipes emissions, other types of rules about ambient air quality standards that really overstep, I think is very possible. I think that there is a large scope for removing a lot of rules that reduce domestic hydrocarbon production in the United States. I think that's very likely. Those are very likely to happen. And then in terms of spending, I think there's 2 areas where I'm very bullish on and one that I'm a little less bullish on, but still somewhat. The 2 I'm very bullish on are putting some kind of cap on Inflation Reduction Act energy tax credits for clean energy and green energy. I hope that Congress repeals the entire IRA, but if they can't do that, I think there's good reason to believe they'll at least put a cap on the annual amount of credits going out and subsidies that are going out, because they are currently uncapped in almost every case that I know of. So I think there's good scope for doing that. Another one, of course,
so how would you cap it? Would you cap it based on how much total they could, or do you cap it by making it even more means tested than it is? Because making it more means tested than it is means pretty much that no one's going to utilize it, because EVs are actually remain very expensive. So
there's the EV credit, but there's also the credit for producers of electricity.
That's true,
right?
And that's super popular, right?
It's very popular. It's very popular in a lot of Republican states. I mean, some of the largest build out in green energy has been in Texas over the last decade or so. So that's possible, though, to put some caps on that. Maybe at least the total amount going out on these different categories would be a step in the right direction. And then one where I'm very bullish on is building a higher wall around the welfare state to further cut back on non-citizen access to means-tested entitlement. Means-tested welfare and entitlement programs. Non-citizens already have limited access under rules, but they still are allowed to get some under certain conditions. They consume, we estimate, about $126 billion a year, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, but it is still about 4% of welfare and entitlement spending in the United States, even though they're about 8% of the population. Still, that number should be as close to zero as possible, and I think that's real scope. One that I am a little bit less optimistic about, but think that there could be some real progress, and I hope there is what Chris mentioned earlier about cutting K-12 education spending and maybe at least some university spending. I mean, there's a real uproar about American universities basically teaching kids a lot of nonsense and wasting a lot of money and putting kids a lot into, into debt, through student loans. So I think there's a real scope to at least reducing the amount of money going directly to universities, especially if they have speech codes that are more restrictive than like the First Amendment. So I think there are some avenues in here that could work. Those are the ones that really leap out to me as politically more possible.
Let me ask you something about the second one. Something about the narrowing or like reducing or bringing down to zero the welfare payments to non-Americans. I mean, I struggle with this only not because I think everyone should get it. It's not what it's just like I always kind of, I would rather more general rules, especially in the case of welfare, where really actually we should bring it down dramatically. But then my next thought is, well, if you just target non-Americans who really shouldn't be getting it in the first place, that's kind of the compact, right? When I got a green card, I had to kind of say I'm not going to be getting any welfare subsidies and things like this. But I'm thinking I guess it can have two benefits, which is first, it shows, that we can cut welfare, and maybe it also kind of makes it easy to argue for immigration. Is that how you think about it? Or
well, I think about it just in total of, listen, I would like to eliminate as much of the welfare state for as many people as possible, right? Mm-hmm. And if I can't do it for everybody, then maybe I can do it for some groups of people. And immigration, new immigrants to the U.S. seems like a very, cuttable place to do it. I think the longest term effect of welfare reform in the 90s that lasted the longest and still persists to the day are the reductions in non-citizen access to welfare benefits. Some of the other reforms have lasted too, but many of them were peeled back in lots of ways. So this one has lasted in large measure, not entirely, until today. And I think immigrants come to the U.S. not because of food stamps or because they want TANF, but because wages here are so much higher and labor market regulations are less than, say, in European countries, so people can actually work themselves up and do well. And by reducing welfare benefits, I think it's just a more positive magnet to come to the United States. I want people who want to come here to work hard and achieve the American dream. I don't want people who are attracted here because of welfare benefits and just the total inequity and unfairness of asking Americans and other immigrants to pay taxes to support welfare in general, but especially of people who want to, come here from overseas. I do think it will have the ancillary effects of perhaps convincing people that immigrants are a net benefit. But even if that's not the effect, and there's no effect there at all, or maybe even if it has the opposite effect, I'd still support it because it's a wise policy that saves money and reduces the burden of welfare. I mean, one of my favorite talking points about this is immigrants are very upwardly mobile in the U.S., even unskilled illegal immigrants, and they do it by consuming much less welfare than native-born Americans. So if people who come here don't speak English, who don't have skills, can build themselves out of poverty, then you too, native-born American who has English as a first language, can do it as well.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what do you think are like the some of the most likely kind of proposal that this administration and the Doge guys will be open to?
Well, I think the big opportunity next year that we haven't talked about is that the Republicans are planning either one or two so-called reconciliation bills. So the 1974 budget process that Congress operates under set up a system where Congress can pass spending cuts through the Senate with only 50 votes rather than the usual 60 in this process called reconciliation. And so Republicans have a chance now. Their tax bill that they're proposing, the Trump tax cuts that they're proposing to extend next year, will be extended through a reconciliation bill. So Republicans will try to attach spending cuts to that bill, and perhaps a bill earlier in the year on Homeland Security. So with reconciliation bills, you can cut entitlement spending, food stamps, Medicaid, school lunch programs, and many others. And at Cato, Adam Michel and I and Romina Boccia put together lists of entitlement programs that we think ought to be cut and reformed in a reconciliation package. Just to give you one example, the food stamp program is a $100 billion a year program. It's absolutely massive. In my mind, it makes absolutely no sense anymore because the program was passed decades ago in a time where low-income folks, there's a real problem of hunger. That is really no longer the case. The nutrition problem of low-income Americans now is obesity. They're eating too much of the wrong types of food. So we're spending $100 billion a year on food stamps. It makes no sense. During the Biden administration, by executive action, he boosted benefits $20 billion a year just by executive action without going through Congress. So that's the type of cut, I think, that should be on the type of program that should be on the chopping block with a reconciliation package next year.
But so if he passed it with executive action, can the president just reverse it?
I think it would be difficult. I think there would be court challenges. I'm not an expert on the legalities of that, but they use sort of occasionally the Department of Agriculture that runs the program is supposed to update its package of its so-called healthy eating package. And it did so, and it boosted benefits by $20 billion. Trump should try to reverse it out by executive action, but I actually think it'll need Congress to cut the benefits back.
What about, are there a lot of savings by reversing the student loan forgiveness? Because that was done by executive order too, right?
That's right. I don't know whether, I don't know the current status of that, but obviously, and I'm sure our listeners know that Biden over and over and over, kept trying to forgive past student debt, which I think is a horribly unfair policy. And I think that was, frankly, one of the issues that tilted a lot of people against Democrats in the last election, because they could see the clear unfairness. If you just finished paying off your student loan, tens of thousands of dollars, and then the government comes along and tells your neighbor that they're going to forgive their loan, the unfairness is obvious, as well as it's a subsidy from taxpayers to high income future lawyers and accountants. It makes no sense. So Trump should, to the extent he can, eliminate those policies as well.
Yeah, I mean, most of the courts have struck down a lot of those, and Biden is in sort of the last stages of trying to put another rule through before he leaves office to do that. It's going to be down to the wire and tough, but it is fortunately smaller than what he initially proposed. But yeah, I mean, Republicans should definitely make sure this doesn't happen again.
But if he puts it through so close to the end, first it's executive order, Trump can just say nope, right? And then they can use the CRA for the rules that have gone through. I can't remember what the time frame is.
Yeah, they have more options for getting rid of them. So as an OMB, there's a plan B for student loan forgiveness that the U.S. Department of Education submitted to the OMB for review. OMB review is sort of in its last steps as of the last reading before being published in the Federal Register. And once it's once it's published, the Education Department can begin reducing or eliminating some of people's loans. But the Supreme Court blocked the first relief plan in June of 2023. So I think whatever ends up happening, it's going to be a fraction of what Biden initially wanted. And there's a lot of scope in terms of the president's power to getting rid of whatever goes through.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. Very quickly, I want to talk about deregulation because it seems to me that this may be kind of what I'm the most bullish on when it comes to DOGE, if only because of who is leading the programs. I mean, these guys kind of, whether it's Musk or Ramaswamy, they kind of have probably a good handle on how regulations and the heavy burden of regulation hinders companies back. And Alex, you've talked about a bunch of the things that they could do. Do you think, it seems to me that there's an appetite to do it? What's your sense on how likely this is?
There is an appetite to do it. There is an appetite to do it last time. And there were some successes. During the last, Trump administration. But it is a hard thing to do because, there are regulations that go way beyond the statutes that were enacted. And those, I think, are the lower hanging fruit, especially since the decision revoking Chevron deference and others. There's some good scope for pulling back some of these regulations, or at least letting court challenges go forward and reduce them. But I think in environmental and energy regulations is where we're going to see some of the biggest changes. There's scope also in healthcare regulation. So Biden pushed forward a regulatory reform that made it harder for people to get these short-term healthcare plans, which are exempt from a large number of federal regulations. So they're a lot cheaper and more adaptive to what people want. So I think that's going to go back into effect where people can buy these short-term plans that are a little better than a lot of these long-term plans. There's probably scope for deregulating childcare to some extent. If you remember, the CHIPS Act had some childcare provisions in there for people receiving subsidies. I mean, I would like CHIPS Act to be entirely eliminated. That's going to be hard to do politically, but maybe at least pull back some of these regulatory changes. One thing, of course, is the au pair visa. The Biden administration started under the last Trump administration, but really Biden pushed it to the max of trying to put more restrictions on the au pair visa program. That runs against another priority of the Trump administration on immigration. But there might be some acknowledgement that this is a great avenue for a lot of folks who can get childcare through that means. So the regulatory state, as you know, is massive. It's an incredible bureaucracy. The rules are complex. Going back to rewrite a lot of these is going to be a challenge, and it requires a lot of great personnel who want to actually do that, who can navigate the administrative state. And that's where I fear the Trump administration will have problems. Yeah. Because I just am not convinced they have the people to do it.
Plus, it's really a long process to do it, because I remember when my former colleague Jerry Ehlig went and worked with Ajit Pai at the FCC, it took them a year and a half to really actually design, to do all the cost-benefit analysis to get rid of net neutrality in a way that it wouldn't come back, right? I mean, and it just, if you think about, that's for one thing, and there's so much to do. And while they make it sound we're going to do this and this and gone and gone and gone and gone.
Yeah.
It seems
the real changes would have to be systemic, right? Like a mandatory sunset provision, for instance, on delegations of rulemaking authority would be great. So Congress can revisit that periodically. The REINs Act, allowing or mandating a Congress vote on rules of a certain size. So, carefully limiting rulemaking authority when it's delegated to federal agencies. I mean, these systemic and frankly, changing and repealing statutes that have promulgated vast amounts of regulation would be the best things to do. But that's mainly on Congress.
Yeah.
I'll give you a point of optimism here, though, is that, we've seen the huge enthusiasm of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and Trump, in recent weeks, talking big about all the reforms they're going to make in government. Well, that is a good thing. And hopefully that helps draw some experienced lawyers into the federal bureaucracy who do want to reform, because they're seeing that Trump is serious. He's set up this special DOGE committee to cut some of these regulations back, and hopefully that'll draw some experienced lawyers into the government to start cutting these regulations. So that is a point of optimism, I think.
I mean, it would be so sad that someone like Elon Musk, who's managed to do, I assume you've seen like the rocket being cut by the robot who's been able to do things like this for the purpose of being able to figure out how to reuse the rockets so we can actually colonize Mars, which seems like totally insane, crazy, difficult, would actually fail.
I mean, like just the in Trump's announcement for the DOGE, he mentioned that it could be like the Manhattan Project of our time. But I think that actually tells you that would be the Manhattan Project was easier because it's a problem of translating theoretical physics into a functional atomic bomb. The problem of deregulating, shrinking a massive federal government where the incentives push in the direction of growing it and have systemically since its creation is a far harder nut to crack, because you're dealing with incentives inside of a bureaucracy that exists in large part to perpetuate itself and to grow its own power. So I want a system where the Elon Musks of the world are not spending their time trying to deconstruct and understand the incentives of the administrative state, and can instead build rockets and electric cars and all this other cool stuff. So I'm very happy that he's here, shining a light on all of these problems, but it's a systemic problem. The government is too big. It does too much. And I want a system where the Elon Musks of the world are more focused on building rocket ships than they are on trying to figure out how to, reduce the unionization activities of federal employees. As important as that is, that's what people like us should be doing, while Elon Musk should be bringing us to Mars.
Yeah, I agree. Exit question. Chris, if you're asked to serve on DOGE, would you go?
No, we can look at Cato. We can, all of these ideas, we were talking about have been around for a long time. We know what to cut. And I'm confident that the incoming Trump administration folks, his new budget director, for example, Russ Vought, is an experienced veteran of DC fiscal policy. He knows what to cut. He knows how to deregulate. They know what they want to do. We're going to continue feeding them ideas. And I don't think that Trump in his first term, to his credit, actually proposed a substantial amount of spending cuts and privatization reforms and bureaucracy reforms. The problem has been Congress. And so we all need to keep the pressure. The Trump administration, we need to push back when Trump does big government stuff. We need to cheerlead and help him push Congress to do the small government stuff. And that's our role at Cato.
Yeah. Alex, I doubt they'd ask you because of your views on immigration, but would you serve if by some weird...
It depends. Part of the problem with talking about this is we don't know the legal form that DOGE is going to take. Mm-hmm. So it could be a presidential advisory committee, some other kind of commission, whatever. But what I, at a minimum, want to do is feed them ideas. And that's what this DOGE report is all about. I just hope that they understand and other people understand that this is a systemic problem of a government that is too big, that needs to be shrunk. A smaller, leaner government is going to be a more efficient government. And that's what I want people to get and to understand.
Well, thank you guys. This was great. Everyone go and read this report. What is it called? I mean, if you Google Cato Institute Doge report, you'll see it. And it's really awesome. It's just lots of things that I love. So
yeah, it's called Cato Institute Report to the Department of Government Efficiency, How to Downsize and Reform the Federal Government.
Yeah. And of course, you guys have way more cuts where this comes from, right? You have way more than what is in this report.
We have a lot more that are in there. I have a list of things that should have been included that we didn't.
Yeah.
So maybe there'll be a volume 2 and a volume 3.
Oh, I hope so. Okay. Well, thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Veronique.